First things first, if you are the parent or caretaker of a child age, 6 to 12, I guess, who has some inclination to go and see G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra, go for it. Take them. Have fun. But make sure you make time to stop at a park or something after. Do not go directly home or anywhere else you keep anything breakable, because this movie is going to make kids lose their fucking mind. Essentially, what's been made here is less an adaptation of either Larry Hama's justifiably praised comic book run or the nostalgic animated series than it is a feature-length narrative translation of the hyperbole-laden toy commercials upon which both were based. The only thing missing from any of the action scenes are the massive hands of an omnipotent kindergartner moving all the players around in a booming voice sagely intoning "batteries not included." If at any point the camera had pulled back to reveal that all the action was actually taking place in the endless sandbox of some celestial godchild, the film would attain a level of perfect metaphysical self-awareness sufficient to tear a hole in the fabric of reality itself. That doesn't quite happen, but is it good? It's good! Hallelujah. Hallelujah. It's really good. It's a big, silly, wild time at the movies. It's tons of fun. How did that happen? I'll tell you how. Because this movie gets it. It knows exactly what it is and what it wants to be. It understands that there's basically two audiences for a movie like G.I. Joe. 7-year-old kids and guys in their late 20s who remember being 7-year-old kids. And unlike Michael Bay's Transformers, it doesn't ignore those audiences in favor of pandering to douchebag fraternity pledges. Is it perfect? Fuck no. It's goofy as hell, most of the actors are phoning it in, and there's some pretty dodgy CGI here and there. But damn it, it cooks! Because it's inventive, imaginative, and it's fun. Remember fun? The kitschy subtitle isn't lying, by the way. G.I. Joe is already established as our story opens, so the plot chiefly concerns establishing a new origin story for Cobra. The domestic terrorists hiding under a suburb origin from the comics likely being too politically edgy, and the antediluvian snake men origin from the cartoon likely being too stupid. Hence what we have here is a new post-9/11, post-Iraq reboot, imagining how a Halliburton-style defense contractor might morph into a mercenary terrorist organization with a thing for shiny masks and serpentine nicknames. And this isn't the only area wherein the film is trying to be somewhat fresh and intellectually engaging. Thematically, G.I. Joe has always been one of those properties that's a lot more interesting to analyze than it reasonably deserves to be. An exuberant romanticism of nationalism and the armed services, in the form of a narrative infomercial primarily designed to encourage the conspicuous consumption of mass-produced plastic playthings by impressionable children, it almost always plays out like something that was designed for the specific purpose of giving an aneurysm to Howard Zinn. The filmmakers have clearly devoted a surprising amount of consideration to how the quintessentially Reagan-era G.I. Joe concept can be relevant in both Obama-era America and an international film market that, let's face it, doesn't have quite the rosy view of U.S. interventionism that it might once have. And while the Joes are carrying around significantly fewer flag decals these days, I'd point out with some amusement that this new global reimagining of a clearly U.S.-backed but untraceable black ops team operating with seemingly unlimited funding outside the reach of any international governing body sounds in some respects like the sort of thing that'd make Dick Cheney go Super Saiyan. But, that's all academic. The important thing is, this is a movie about two teams of good guys and bad guys with silly costumes and wacky nicknames going at it with every weapon, gadget, vehicle, secret base, ninja, whatever that $175 million can afford to put on screen. The screenplay and choreography seem to have been generated by giving a bucket of action figures to a room full of hyperactive children and transcribing every damn thing they came up with, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. With all the cool gadgets, imaginative action scenes, over-the-top supervillains, and colorful locations, it's got much less in common with most gritty modern blockbusters than it does with the gee-whiz flights of fancy in the incalculably optimistic Golden Age 007 films. In fact, I'll say it up front, G.I. Joe is a better James Bond movie than the last 12 James Bond movies. Silly without being stupid. Self-aware without being a parody. I'm prepared to call this the best pure action roller coaster whatever movie of the summer. It's not the smartest, it's not the coolest looking, but it's the most enjoyable because it's honest with itself. It's not a Frankenstein of other movies like Terminator, it's not a flaccid cash-in like Wolverine, and it's not ashamed of its source material like Star Trek and Transformers. If you ever spent a summer afternoon staging epic battles between plastic soldiers and you can get back into that headspace now, G.I. Joe is for you. See you next time.
Yeah, so I don't disagree retroactively with my enthusiasm on this one so much. I mean, it's way over the top, the movie and my review of it, and I'm a total mark for Stephen Sommers going all the way back to The Mummy, certainly. But I still have fun with this one when it comes on. Sincerely, my reaction at the time was legit coming from a place of everyone just assuming this was going to be terrible because the trailers weren't great. Everyone knew that the studio kind of took it away from the directors and the writers and re-edited it after the fact. They'd canceled the press screenings, there'd been reshoots. It had not been a good year for action movies up to that point, so I really did come out of the G.I. Joe movie feeling like, wow, that was candy-coated nonsense and I kind of fucking loved it. You know, just for the sake of tidiness, I've gone back and stuck the sequel review after this part, even though it was a few years later. I don't really have notes on that one, Retaliation, at least my review of it. The review is pretty much still where it stands. You know, and the Snake Eyes movie was recent enough that it's just on the regular channel on its own. I wonder how long it is before we try this one for a fourth time. Huh. Well, this was kind of a letdown. I think the main problem with G.I. Joe Retaliation is that the original G.I. Joe The Rise of Cobra is a thing that existed. Now, granted, I'm one of the only people I know who thinks the first live-action movie was actually pretty good. Yeah, it was a ridiculous ball of hyperactive childish nonsense, but from where I sit, that's what made it, in tone if not in design, a faithful adaptation of a cartoon about a top-secret yet massive and somehow very public military outfit that occasionally conscripts ninjas, professional wrestlers, football players, and video game characters.
It's the most lethal G.I. Joe team yet! Capcom Street Fighter 2! No way! Wait! There's Guile, Ryu, Zangief, Blanca, and Dalsim! What's a Dalsim? Oh! Some with real ninja moves! Hey!
But Cobra's got Street Fighters too!
Vega, Sagat, Balrog!
And me, El Bison!
They look unbeatable!
So, yeah, it was a good movie, but not a great one, and while liking it, I have to concede it was kind of a mess, and while it didn't make a huge difference, it was kind of disappointing that the filmmakers scrapped and reworked a lot of the iconic characters' original designs and personalities, since, you know, those were always the most memorable things about them. Retaliation wants to very much correct that more fan-service-oriented criticism of the series, presenting a version of the characters in their world that looks more directly lifted from the animated series and the comics, but it also wants to do so while spending substantially less money and operating on a much smaller scale than the famously overstuffed original, which in and of itself would be fine, except it also wants to maintain strong ties to the continuity of the original since, well, continuity in blockbusters is important now. Unfortunately, this becomes a problem when the realities of budget and casting intrude on that goal. Retaliation asks its audience to remain very invested in certain plot points from the first film, but other things it seems to just want us to forget or put out of our minds. For example, the film's main plot of the US government being taken over from within and turning against the Joes is built entirely on the Zartan impersonating the president cliffhanger from the end of the first one. But when said evil fake president orders an airstrike that appears to kill maybe 20 or 30 people tops, and we're told that this means G.I. Joe has been completely destroyed, we're, I guess, supposed to forget that in one movie earlier, G.I. Joe had like 1,000 guys operating out of an underground city so huge they had their own indoor ocean for submarine drills. But maybe internal consistent logic is too much to ask from this sort of thing. Anyway, that is the starting point of the film. Cobra, now secretly in control of the United States government, frames G.I. Joe for treason and wipes out the entire team except for Flint, Snake Eyes, Lady J, and the Scorpion King, as part of a larger plan being orchestrated by the newly freed Cobra commander with the assistance of Storm Shadow and his ninja clan. Snake Eyes is dispatched to recruit Blind Master and Jinx to help handle the ninja side of the problem, while Jay, Flint, and the Tooth Fairy seek aid from G.I. Joe's founder, General Cameo. Oh, and Firefly is in there too, because Cobra needed one more guy. If all that sounds like basically a handful of dudes fighting another handful of dudes, it basically is. Cobra seems to have enough guys around to provide the occasional cannon fodder, but the whole thing is exceptionally small scale except for the big world-ending explosion stuff that happens in big CGI set pieces that don't directly involve any of the main characters. Even the much-touted mountain battle with the ninjas is very obviously a work of green screen effects and backlots. Cheap and small scale doesn't necessarily mean bad, of course, it's just weirdly dissonant when we're told that the fate of the world is being decided and that these events are leading off from the much bigger events we keep being reminded happened in the first one, which makes it not difficult to notice that the first film ended with a massive underwater battle in and around and above a giant supervillain headquarters involving whole armies, while the sequel ends with a shootout on a beach involving a couple of tanks and a hovercraft. Yeah, that's it. The problem might be that the movie just isn't goofy enough, given its preposterous plot and roster of funny-named characters. You know what might actually have helped? Maybe if, like, The Rock, instead of playing Roadblock, was actually just playing The Rock, like if he joined G.I. Joe. I mean, like I said, Sergeant Slaughter joined G.I. Joe and he was just himself, so did Refrigerator Perry and he was a football player. Hell, the Street Fighters even joined.
It's not as tough as Championship Edition Guile going boom in his Sonic Boom tank, or the Beast Blaster. It comes with Championship Edition Blanca and Chun-Li and fires double trouble missiles.
Street Fighter 2!
So, like, if part of the plot was just, hey, The Rock, Uncle Sam wants you to join G.I. Joe, I don't know, maybe that might have been a better movie, I guess. As it stands, none of this makes G.I. Joe Retaliation a bad movie, it's just kind of flimsy and cheap. It looks and feels more like the more CGI-heavy version of a low-end G.I. Joe movie Canon Films or Golden Globus might have made in the mid-80s, and if it had been, it might have been a pretty big deal at the time, and maybe even fondly remembered today. But as a sequel in 2013, it just ends up feeling like a weird what the hell is this entry in the franchise.